Good evening, beautiful people. So about a decade ago, I went to the Library of Congress for a celebration, a ceremony celebrating the acquisition of Carl Sagan's papers. And after all the speeches and festivities, they gave us access to the actual archives. And I love an archive. So there I was, digging through the letters and the diaries and the lecture notes. And I came upon a letter that Carl Sagan wrote to his pal, Timothy Leary, in prison, coordinating their prison visit. And as a kind of postscript, he said, there's this young poet, her name is Diane Ackerman, he misspelled her last name, and she writes beautifully about the universe, and here's a poem you might like. And he had copied out, by hand, the poem. And I loved it, and of course I wondered who was this Diane Ackerman, what became of her. And I learned that she very much went on to become a poet, that Carl Sagan was her doctoral advisor, and the poem was part of a book that was eventually published called The Planets, a Cosmic Pastoral. And so I went out looking for it and was very sad to find it was out of print. I paid, I think it was something like $47 for an antiquarian copy, which, you know, in my late 20s, living in a shoebox was not nothing, and it was worth every penny. And long and short of it is, Diane and I became friends through this. And over the years, your poems, your prose have given me so much vigor and aliveness. And every time I read you, I think of John Keats, who one winter night in 1817 raised the glass and indicted Newton for unweaving the rainbow, taking the magic out of nature with the science. And I experience you as first of all, a greater poet than Keats, because you are celebrating the rainbow in the science and the magic, and how appreciating science magnifies and deepens reality as opposed to subtracting the magic. And I want to know how you ended up there as a young, you were Keats' age when you wrote The Planets.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much. And it was a revelation for me to discover you through your work as well. I think the first one was the column you did on time. And I shouldn't call it a column, it's more of a wonder cabinet, or commonplace book, as we were saying. And you went from time, I think in Bachelard, time in Borges, time in so many different avenues. And I thought, this is a woman who's a kindred spirit. Yeah, and I've been reading it ever since. But how I got there? Well, you know, when I looked at this book, again, after 50 years, I started wondering how I got there too, you know, because I hadn't really been trying to bring together science and poetry before then. I all of a sudden went out and looked at the comic Kubutek and started writing a poem about it, and before I knew it, I had to include the science, because keeping it out is crazy. It's like missing out on so much of everyday life. From when I was very little, I always took the universe literally as one verse. You know, science didn't start where poetry ended. Trees were as much science as microbiota, and as much nature. And I felt that to be a nature poet, you had to include all of nature. And now what we call science is really everyday nature in our lives. And it seemed crazy not to include it. However, the people at Cornell at the time in the English department thought I was nuts. And that I would have no future. And it would ruin my career, because didn't I appreciate the fact that science was the antipathy of the humanities, that scientists had no feelings. And I thought, where on earth do you come to get an idea like that? There was a senior critic who took me aside and said, what's a nice girl like you doing writing about amino acids? And I said, wait a minute, amino acids build the universe. You know, there's nothing wrong.
You didn't say, what's a nice cluster of amino acids like you, asking me that question.
Good I tried to explain that I didn't think that the universe was knowable from just one perspective, but it was not a popular thing to do. Fortunately, Carl was open to exploration in every field. He had an immense curiosity about the world, and he did not feel that there was any need not to be questing for poetic beauty at the same time that you're questing for scientific accuracy. It made perfect sense to him that they could be both together.
I mean, what strikes me about this is that pulsating beneath both is the sense of wonder.
Yes.
And in a way, to me, reading the planets now is somehow even more necessary because wonder is the only potent antidote to selfing.
Absolutely.
The kind of caving in.
The claustrophobia of self.
Claustrophobia. And we live in a time where so much of our suffering is a problem of selfing.
I think that's right, absolutely. You have to be able to get out of yourself with a really interesting attention grabber. And wonder does that. I mean, wonder, I think, is the most potent of all of the elements on the periodic table of the heart. You know, even the tiniest fleck of it just stops time. That's it. And if you let it fill your heart and your mind, there's no space left over for anything else. You can't do mind theaters, you can't do anything else. It so changes who you are for those moments that it is occupying you completely. Because essentially you're giving yourself, as you say, to something else. You're falling in love with something. And the minute you do that, your focus changes.
And paradoxically, sometimes it is in the darker moments where we're most open to wonder. I just did a talk about wonder in Santiago in Chile in Spanish, and it really struck me that in Spanish, the word for wonder, asombro, shares a root with sombra, which means shadow.
Yeah.
And it is often in the shadow of the mind where the aperture, everything becomes brighter through that small aperture of wonder. Things kind of come into sharper relief and we're more open, more receptive. Do you find that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it has always been my go-to when I've had trials of different kinds, or I was nursing my husband, my late husband now, through a series of strokes, and helping him get his language back and so on. It was a great privilege to do it. It brought us a lot closer, but it was very depleting. And what really was my salvation was the wonder that I found. And not just like wonder in big things. We tend to think, oh, I'll go on an eclipse trip, and there will be wonder. I'll go for an adventure someplace, and there will be wonder. And it's not going to be there if you don't take it with you. That's the thing. It's the wonder of everyday miracles, the very small ones that we just don't pay attention to. They slip by unnoticed so often, and yet are exquisitely beautiful and momentous in their own way and miraculous.
And language is one of those sources of wonder.
Yes.
That if you take the magnifying glass close enough, it shimmers with it. I mean, what a poignant experience for you to nurse the person you love back to life through language. Because one of the first things I thought when I read The Planets, in which you have this wonderful glossary at the end, and I thought, who is this person that rests tenderness from terms? I mean, these are scientific terms. So, for example, for gravitation, you say, the apparently universal mutual attraction of bodies. and some of them are just prose poems. The one for black holes, I won't read it. You will get the book and you read it, but it's so beautiful. And it's interesting that the terms anchor the wonder, and you build these cathedrals of meaning around these units of truth in the poems. And with that, would you mind reading the prologue for us?
Oh, sure. Delighted to. while a blue-green tea clipper called Earth lifts starward in the bowels of summer on the birthday of Copernicus. I'm beginning this poem with what I plan to ignore, the shuntling of the white tulle curtains, beyond which daylilies are breaking out like sunspots, the platoon of cream and caramel bugs turning the yard into a lakey twitch, the rodents with their tiny eyes black as sensen, the lackawanna wrapping its wet thighs around the delta, even the woodpecker typing on my sun-broiled shutter, all the bud-breaking polycomb gibber and fidget, volcanic mayhem barreling through summer, whose weedy delirium I quit, but reluctantly and with other deliriums in mind, to pull free of Earth's whalebone stay and sally out into the cold compress of the universe, lending my psyche to Copernicus for a commemorative issue. Perhaps I've too much at stake on these cryptic petri dishes orbiting the sun, if nothing's afoot here but dumbbell, love seat, and orlop craters, hotbed simoom, and marmoreal dust. In what clinic will my dashed hopes renew? Sweet Urania, line your airy lungs with gold and bear with me a while. I'm young as I write this and green, yet in my lifetime will never sail beyond Pluto or cut time on the bias in a black hole in space, even leave the twirl of wood ash that's our Milky Way. For me, the Crab Nebula will never be made real. So I'm lighting out for the planetary wilderness, a gambler for whom it's either surfeit or famine. The planets are 9 dice, rolling in the dark.
Thank you. So, one of the things that I was wondering about, it's been 50-some years since you published.
Yes, it has.
And our knowledge of the universe has greatly increased. We have sequenced the human genome, we have heard black holes colliding, we have detected the so-called God particle. I'm not sure our understanding of the universe, of why we're here, has changed.
No, we're still questing for meaning. We're still trying to figure out who and what we are. We don't know what we are as a species yet. And I think we don't really accept that we're an adolescent species. And we act like adolescents.
Bipeds with the giant dreams.
Yes, indeed.
It's a line of Diane's from
We Are Listening.
We Are Listening about the search for extraterrestrial life. What has surprised you the most in the world of science and the world of wonder in these 50 years, half a century?
You asked me that when you were writing a Marginalia column.
Yes.
And I thought you might ask me again. Because I decided I was going to maybe turn that into a poem.
Oh, fantastic.
I don't know.
love being
I thought I'd work on it. Once I thought the universe's greatest gift was scale, those vaulting immensities of gas and dust, planets flaring like thoughts inside a skull of stars. But time, that sly astronomer, has shown me something subtler. How much of the same splendor hums within us and all of nature. The pulse of a leaf opening to the sun, the quiet veering away of a child's attention, my own heartbeat, a small percussion in ancient starlight. All are galaxies folded inward, universes in miniature. What surprises me now is not just the infinite, but the intimate. That carbon dust became breath and laughter. That our cells remember ancient oceans. That every discovery, no matter how remote, begins with the same feral impulse. Our roving curiosity reaching outward, hoping to belong to a larger story of life seeding itself throughout the universe. The cosmos expands, and so does our vertiginous curiosity, an old companion still sending sparks of wonder through the brief chapters of our lives. Yeah. one of the reasons that I felt bonded with you and your work in the beginning was that your sense of wonder was palpable. You know, it was clear that you gave yourself fully to the universe that is surrounding us, and dealt with it in a state of wonder, almost like freshets of wonder from time to time. I could picture you doing those things. And now, of course, that I've known you better, I know that you do that. You go out rock collecting and...
Thank you. What's interesting to me about wonder is that it cannot coexist with certainty. So wonder is a state of uncertainty, of openness to possibility.
Yes.
And I'm interested in what you just read about scale, because what's so moving to me about the planets is that you go out there on the enormous cosmic scale of, far away, light years away galaxies, and yet at the same time, it is so rich with the texture of the minutest human experience, the hand trembling at the touch of another. And how do you negotiate or translate between these scales, neither one of which we naturally comprehend in our day-to-day. Our day-to-day lives are suspended in this kind of middle where we don't quite touch the macro and the micro.
But the vastness was part of the appeal. Poetry is so often trying to hold the infinite in a very small vessel, a line, a poem, a turn of phrase. But in the case of something like the planets, suddenly the infinite was completely available. When I started thinking about Jupiter's storms, bigger than any of the continents on Earth, or light coming to us from sources that were around long before we ever were, it gave me such a thrill of opportunity. It opens up the spectacle of the possible. What is possible in the universe, and also what is possible to think. There is a Uranus poem in here, which is pretty bawdy, I have to say. Includes all of the astronomers, not all of them, some of the astronomers royal. And it's called Pataphysics, this conference that they're involved in as they're on their way to Uranus, and they're trying to figure out what Uranus is going to be like. Pataphysics is the science of imagining possibilities, imagining solutions. And if you don't start there, how are you going to find what you're looking for? Your mind has to be open enough that it's possible. One of the things, though, that as you were saying that I was thinking about was, how does a scientific fact become a poetic image? There's a thought, and for both of us.
Well, interesting you mentioned that, because I was thinking about how poetry in a way gives us anchors into which to imagine the possible that we haven't yet been able to name.
Exactly.
But language is an interesting thing, because language is a vessel for thought that shapes the context, right?
Yes.
And the great revelation of Einstein's relativity was that he kind of demonstrated that space and time are a single fabric, and it's the fabric of the universe. And on that fabric, matter tells space-time how to bend, and the curvature of space-time tells matter how to move. And similarly, language tells thought how to bend, and thought tells language how to move. And to me, it's so moving to see someone who writes about fact with feeling, unafraid to write about fact with feeling, that they're not exclusionary. Back to your childhood sense that it's the universe, it's
Yes.
one thing. And I think the possible only becomes possible when we give it this space between fact and feeling that is a continuum, not a binary.
Yes, I agree with you entirely. And also, maybe we forget that language is itself poetic. All languages, every language on the planet uses metaphor, because the brain does. The brain requires it. The brain requires a poetic version of life in order to cope with it. I say that because if you start looking at almost any sentence, you will find the submerged metaphors and similes that are in there. we say that we grasp an idea. Okay, we're touching it. You know, everything we say is like that because the brain can only know the world through our senses. And that's the way it makes sense of things. But when it does that, it's bringing together seemingly unrelated things, what's happening in the brain and what's going on out there, and bringing them together in a way that is stronger than either one.
And when did you have this realization? Because after The Planets, you went on to write, I mean, much more poetry, but also beautiful prose. I love your book, The Natural History of the Senses. It is a revelation, and there's a new edition coming out next year. But that was quite a bit after this.
Yeah.
And that is very much a book about how our sensorium shapes our reality, and in a way it's so kindred to how we experience the universe.
Yeah, that's true. I've been obsessed with our perceptions for as long as I can remember. I think I was just born like that. I think artists tend to get born into their perceptual systems. Doesn't mean that everybody who is born like that will become an artist, but it helps a lot. I can't do mathematics even now to save my soul. I can't do basic arithmetic, yet I could fly planes because you could do workarounds, you know, use the circular slide rule and so on. But even as a child, I remember walking through an orchard on the way to first grade with some friends, and they were going to be doing shadow drawings, and we didn't want to miss that, so we were in a hurry. And I looked up in the orchard, and I saw bats, I thought. And actually they were plums, but they looked like bats. And I was so stunned, so wonderstruck. I just stood there looking, and my friends came back and said, "What are you looking at?" And when I told them about the plums that were bats, they looked horrified. And they were not horrified about the bats. They were horrified that somebody could look at something like that and see bats. And of course, the difference between that and, let's say, schizophrenia is you know that you're making that distinction. It's fun to do it in a sense. It brings a new kind of reality to it. It brings texture to it that you can see and feel in your mind's eye in a different way, and I think poetry does that.
These ways of seeing, right? That wonderful line from William Blake to his painting saying, "The tree that moves some to tears of joy is to others a green thing that stands in the way. As a man is, so he as a man is, so he sees."
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask a very divisive question. Trigger warning.
Okay.
Where do you stand on Pluto now?
Oh no. Well, does this mean I could stand on Pluto? I would like that. You know, the heart-shaped plateau. That would be very nice. Oh boy, I remember it as a planet. I get why they're not. You know, they're saying if that's a planet, then how about the ones that are even bigger? You know, that are out there that we don't call planets. I understand that. But boy, I grew up with that. How about you?
So, okay, I'm going to defer to the authorities here. Some years ago, my friend Krista, who has a show called On Being, had a gathering live event. And she had asked me to be in conversation with some astronomer that she really liked. She said, her name is Natalie, you're really going to like her. So we go to the green room, and I, very pleased with myself, have realized that it's the anniversary of the discovery of Pluto. That day, it was February. And I have come to the green room with a copy of Diane's poem Pluto, prepared to impress Natalie the astronomer. And Natalie the astronomer shows up in the green room, and we're both wearing red boots, and we're like, And then she pulls out of her bag a copy of Diane's poem Pluto. And now Natalie is one of my closest friends.
And one of mine, too.
And one of Diane's. But the point of all of this is to say Natalie Battaglia, she led the Kepler mission from NASA. She works on the search for extraterrestrial life. One of the top astronomers in the world. She says Pluto's a planet.
All right. Yes.
Redemption.
I know.
that note, can we hear a poem about an indisputable planet, a fragment of Mars?
I would be delighted. It's hard not to be enraptured by Mars, if only because of the nomenclature. Schiaparelli went absolutely mad with giving names, and you can find Coprades, a ship river. You can go from candor to chaos. You can go to utopia. It's really quite an extraordinary place of names. So that was a lot of fun, but also just physically what it turned out Mars looked like. Orange ochre tonight, Ice Age Mars gutters like a Turner-painted sun. Brilliant white polar caps wax and wane with the weathery, not the growing seasons. I know the rough, bouldery terrain and volcanic sputum by heart. Think of the pumice soap, the obsidian jewelry like folds of black satin, limonite speckled brown and mustard, on each grain a fleck of iron, its own tiny anchor. The pocked lava rocks that look like red sponges, the charred basalt grilled in mid-pour. Perhaps Mars fell together once long ago, and now in an ice age, its former atmosphere, tucked discreetly under a polar cap, awaits the coming of another spring. Meanwhile, the winds chafe like emery boards, carving rock into free forms and sway-backed arches. There was a climate here once, running water and the blossom urge, where sinuous dry riverbeds stand out now like veins on a temple. Yet Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the whole solar system, may erupt tonight or not for a century. I hope it will tonight. I try to imagine a mountain 20 miles high, 7 Alps perched one upon the other's shoulders. How can it be this lily-livered flesh houses the same atoms that built the Andes and Himalayas? I am ashamed for my lymph nodes, paltry nubs even on the planetary scale. My arms cascade, not knowing where to go. Each day my mind pitches its tent elsewhere, and suddenly I have so many toes. I think how land forms, massive, bulky, into stolid plateaus and great brawny sierras, and am startled what touch-and-go creatures we are on this minor planet of a humdrum star. So this is where Elysium lies, just north of Atlantis, on the far side of Barsoom. A velvet landfall where volcanoes dome gently like saucers overturned. Crater crowns blend, no sharp cone-like rises ever snag or grow thorny, and canyons meander like loosed wine. And there, delirious in our padded cell, while 2 moons climb and reclimb a purple sky, we'll see late afternoon clouds lurch overhead, and the grinding wheel wind buff obsidian till it gems in the light. And when it's summer, the bald noon sun dims behind a dust arroyo, let's board a night freight to Lemuria, a string of opera-length craters, and like Laplanders dock the polar steps, while electronic cows nibble the hoarfrost, their udders ripe with water, in a land where even ice sublimes. Love, fly with me to utopia. 3 majestic snow-palled volcanoes poking up through the sockeye dust. Like Sherpas astraddle our mechanical goats, will guide parties all across the chapped terrain, early sea cliffs and ochre pastures, tending our rock leeches that suck mineral and water till gorged they thud like geckos to the ground. Come away to the highlands of Tharsis and watch the red world simmer below, teeming with dust devils and stiff black shadows, towering sand dunes, lava plugs. Once in a blue sun, when volcanoes heave up grit regular as pearls and light runs riot, we'll watch the sun go darker than the sky. Violet dust tufts wheel on the horizon, amber cloud banks pile, and the whole of color-crazed Mars ignite. Come make a dun mare of a wind-carved arch, and as the rusty sand blows past, we'll dream ourselves a gallop this side of tranquility, just beyond utopia and through the Martian moors.
Any questions?
Would you go to Mars?
Would I go?
Yes. Would you go to the moon?
I mean, that's some serious exposure therapy to see what's coming.
Yes.
I am too much in love with the green of the biosphere to enjoy a desert landscape.
I wouldn't want to live there, but I would like to go to the moon and be able to look back on Earth. I think that would be...
Earthrise. would be
Oh,
amazing.
Earthrise, yes. And see everything you've ever loved, everything you've ever known in one place. Oh, that would be wonderful.
Okay, our icebreaker. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I have a friend who's a physics professor, and she says that you spend enough time in physics, you become either a poet or a believer in God, or both.
Yes.
And so I would love to learn a little bit more about your process of engaging with the science and the discovery as you're writing, or before you're writing, or after you're writing. What is that like for you?
In how I use the science?
Yes.
You know, the scientific facts kind of arrive as shy visitors. And they stand there sometimes in their lab coats, and maybe they clear their throat a little. And I can salute them and file them away, which I very often do. And I am wiser for that. But they don't really come alive for me unless I can bring them into my body through my senses. You know, I have to be able, let's just say it's a fact like that every atom inside of us was forged in the suns, in the stars. I love knowing that, but it's not really alive until I can feel it like a small private supernova under my ribs, you know, or a hand-me-down coat of starlight or something like that. And just even saying that now, my brain reaches, because it's true for all of us, for what's familiar. The brain knows about coats, it knows about ribs, it knows about starlight and hand-me-down stuff. And I think what maybe happens is the mind allows those facts to borrow the images that are very familiar for a while. And that borrowing is where you cross the threshold. And suddenly you have invited the fact into your kitchen, you know, and it is rubbing shoulders with your memories, and it's rummaging through your junk drawer of associations, and it's becoming personal to you, and reminds you of things like maybe your grandmother's alabaster skin. All of a sudden, you have moved away from it just being a fact, and it becomes related to things in your intimate history and life. And I think that's very often where you find the imagery coming together, at least for me, because the metaphors cover that barren space where we don't have words for the experience that we have. The only way we can get at it is by pulling together seemingly unrelated things. And that reminds me of In Cold Blood. I remember after that came out, there were psychologists who said, you know, neither of those two killers could have performed those deeds by himself. But together, they formed a third person who is able to kill. In a very positive way, metaphor does that. Is that too weird? You know, it neither of the images can do it by itself, but when you introduce them to each other, they form this kind of marriage that covers something that is otherwise unsayable.
Well, you just described how the brain makes metaphor in early developmental psychology. The strange, wondrous things that children say
Yes,
are based on familiar things that they're trying to map onto a new experience or thing that is
exactly.
unfamiliar.
It's so.
And metaphor is always the handle on the door of the unfamiliar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for this conversation. It's been wonderful. I have a very simple question. I work in publishing and think a lot about presentation. Can I ask about the subtitle of this book? And especially the word pastoral, which I know enough to know I don't know anything about. Thank you.
Well, I called it a cosmic pastoral because if I had just called it the planets, I thought they're going to think that I've chosen sides here. You know, that it's either just science or it's just poetry, and it's someplace in between. And so for me, there is nothing special about a meadow that is different from a nebula. You know, there's no reason why there should be a preference when we think about the proper realm of poetry for things that are involved with meadows and trees and flowers and stuff, but not with the synchrotron or various other things that we find in science. And so it's cosmic. It has to do with the universe that we tend to think of in a very scientific way, and that I am including science in. But it's still just nature for me. And if it's the pasture of the stars, I think of the stars that way sometimes.
It's the infinite and the intimate again, right?
Yeah.
And on that note, since you asked about publishing, I do want to say about the cover. Our cover of this edition is completely different. So some years ago, also in the Library of Congress archive, I found this quilt that a woman named Ella Harding Baker spent 7 years making in 1883, finished it in 1883, to teach women astronomy when they were not allowed into university. And Margaret, the wonderful McNally Jackson in-house designer, decided to use that quilt on the cover. So there's, I mean, a quilt of the solar system is the intimate.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Literally stitching it together.
Thank you.
I didn't know that story. I found it.
Thank you. This is just a fabulous discussion. Really enjoying it all. This is a question about sort of cognition and language, because both of you write prose, both of you, I think, write poetry. I am a science writer, so my job usually is to try to write for wide audiences, but kind of in an expository and prose way. Every now and again, I give myself permission to get into a poetic zone. And what I find, just if I'm really curious about my own process, my own way of being when I'm switching from one mode to another, it's very different. I feel like I'm giving myself a gift in a way of opening doors to parts of my brain when I'm writing poetry that are not the doors that are open when I'm writing, say, a science article. So I'm just curious about how you feel about those two different ways of accessing your brain as you become wizards with language in these two different
We
ways.
both do that. I mean, you do that in the divinations all the time. And I know you don't necessarily think of them as poems, but I do. I think of them as found poems.
Diane's referring to these strange thing that I did, taking 19th century ornithological books and cutting up the scientific descriptions of bird species and rearranging the words into, I mean, she called them poems, I call them, I don't know, something. Conversations with the unconscious. But it's interesting though, because this is only a question that can be asked in this century, and maybe the second half of the last, because it didn't used to be two different ways.
Right.
I mean, the people who wrote about science in the old astronomy books and the ornithological books that I was using, they were poets, and not just figuratively, but they read poetry, they wrote poetry. The journals and the notebooks of, Humphrey Davy and all these people are strewn with poems. They went to poetry readings. It was just so much more, it wasn't so divided. And actually, one defiant thing that my friend Willow, who's here, Willow Defeval, who runs Atmos, we do this thing every Saturday where we take one article of the Science News, and we cut it up and we make divinations. And it's so interesting to notice the language, that there is actually very poetic language in scientific reporting, depending on how you orient the light of the mind around it. And I hope that more science writers will not be afraid of feeling, the language of feeling.
I agree, and not be afraid of playing with the language and seeing if you twist it just a little bit in your mind, and shake it a little bit, if you don't find that interesting intuition that's come out of it.
Thank you. Well, a couple more.
Hi. Thank you both so much. I have to thank you each individually. As someone who came from a very fundamentalist religion, I found my freedom and liberation really through science and poetry. So your poetry, your figuring, highly, highly instrumental in my own liberation. So thank you both very, very truly. Which brings me to the point, being in this gorgeous cathedral, how do you see science and poetry being sort of an antidote to the certitude and the attempt to create quantified and qualified kind of framework through which we experience wonder, through which we experience what is sacred and divine? And do you see science and poetry as being an antidote to the certitude of religion?
I don't see it as being an antidote. I see it as being another choice. Everyone can have their beliefs. But there is a hunger, I think, in people who are not necessarily believers, but still do want spirituality, still feel spirituality profoundly. Sometimes they reach for eco-spirituality, and that certainly works, but it's all about transcendence, ultimately. And the poetry and metaphors, very much in religion too, and in science, and everything.
I very much see it as an antidote. I do think the need for reverence of reality is enormous. I think science teaches us to meet reality on its own terms, and poetry helps us deepen and broaden the terms on which we meet each other. And both of these things religion does not do, and in fact antagonizes, in my view. So yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, last question.
I want to thank you both also. This was extraordinary. And especially coming from a place as a little girl, I loved space and science and Star Trek and Star Wars and all things that were historically really considered, I thought, more for boys or for men. But I loved it, and I continue to love it. And I feel there's sort of a politicizing of it right now, especially as some of the advances around space exploration have been attributed to maybe certain people that, like, when I feel like it's almost not even PC anymore to say, okay, I think it'll be incredible to go to the moon. I think it would be incredible to explore space or to talk about space even. It's become a little bit like, well, we should just deal with the issues that we have here as humans, and I think it's not mutually exclusive, it's actually together. So I think this conversation is so important, but I'm just wondering if you have some insights to share about, like, I don't know, I just often feel at a loss in those moments of what I can say or do to share the love and the joy and the wonder and the transcendence, and somehow that's kind of being lost in the conversation.
So one thing that really helps me in my life is having some historical perspective for all the things we're experiencing that we think are new and have never happened before. So in 1769, the first global scientific collaboration happened, which was an observation of the transit of Venus, when Venus passes in front of the sun. And it was, let me shorten this. Halley, for whom we have Halley's comet, had predicted that if you observe the transit of Venus from different vantage points on Earth, by simple trigonometry, you'd be able to calculate the Earth-Sun distance. So up to that point, we had a map of the universe where we had no scales. So in the middle of a war-torn world, all these scientists from all kinds of different countries traveled months, many of them died on the way to observe this transit, to make a map of the universe for this presumably hunger for truth and knowledge and reverence and wonder. However, King George III appointed James Cook, a surveyor, as the captain of the English expedition, using the scientific mission actually to find the Great Northwest Passage, which was a very lucrative, imaginary, at that point, trade route, and the Great Southern Continent, hypothesized, now known as Antarctica, that nobody had been to. So he was doing a land grab as the American colonies were slipping out of his grip. And he was doing that under the guise of the scientific mission. And this has happened over and over and over. Colonizers, exploiters, tyrants will always try to subdue the hunger for truth, the hunger for power, but that doesn't mean extraordinary science hasn't been done all the while. And the people who are on the side of truth have prevailed over that, because that is how we have any knowledge today. And so it is not new. I mean, King George III was the Elon Musk of his time, you know. It's gonna be okay.
I think that's great. That really puts it in perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So Diane only will be signing. In the hall to my right, I was told to say, though I see no hall to my right. So there is a hall to my right. There, Kate?
And back.
Yes, you will find it. Wherever the book signing is, go there, please. Thank you so much.